Welcome to the Darnell and Cody show, where we talk about social, political, and philosophical issues currently relevant to us as a society. Today's topic is education, and it's a broad topic, so I'll be breaking it down into a few sections. First, we will begin into the current state of public education and its methods, including the effectiveness of standardized testing. Then we'll move on to what can be improved in our current system, followed by questions of funding and finances regarding our public schools. And lastly, we'll wrap up our discussion with whether or not private schools should be banned, as well as homeschooling, and where the matter stands in regards to equal opportunity versus equal education for students. So before we dive in, Cody, could you give us your vision of an ideal public school system and form of education, just to introduce the topic for our audience before we tackle the specifics?
Sure, I think my ideal system is kind of really helps out free thinking. I want thought and thought process to be one of the top things that schools teach, which they don't really teach critical thinking and stuff like that nowadays in elementary school or high school. So I feel as though those are the subjects that we're missing. But as for the ideal system, it looks kind of like somewhat government regulated. It's got restrictions on certain things that should be taught or shouldn't be taught. It gets funding from hopefully the local counties as well as the federal government. And, it kind of looks the way it does in America right now, but we need more funding and just better curriculum, basically.
Right, and those are all very interesting points, and we'll be delving into them very shortly. I particularly like the point about critical thinking, and we'll get to that. But let's start with explaining the current state of public education along with its methods. So to give you some loose cursory statistics, the US is currently ranked around 27th for education, and about 50% of our government expenditure goes to education, and we're around the 17th percentage spent on education among OECD. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development nations. The top-ranking nations on these tests were East Asian countries, with Singapore at number one, followed by Scandinavia, and the rest of Europe with Canada in the mix. The average PISA score program of international student assessment was 490, and the US stands around 470. Now, we can make of that what we will. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that the US probably spends the most out of these nations on education, just based on what our GDP and what we take in as taxes. The fact of the matter is, though, that's undeniable, is that we are doing worse than the other OECD nations, and that's another thing. Are we to really measure education based on their standards? And I bring these statistics up because they are what people tend to use to argue about the deficiency of our education system, as if being ranked for 27th in education in some study is the problem, as if the problem with our education system is that it is comparatively lower in rank than some 26 odd countries. Well, let's look at education system in South Korea, which is consistently ranked in the top 10 and sometimes in first place in various studies. So South Korea is actually notorious for a flawed public education system. In order to stay economically relevant and competitive, public academies are by far the norm, and public schools are more or less just seen as places where students come to take tests, especially as they get older. Going by those rankings, then, the US would be better off adopting this system. At least that's what the argument becomes if we were to give ultimate merit to these statistical rankings. But let's focus on real education is as an idea, not as a statistic measured by Scantron sheets. And that's what we want to talk about today. So instead, let's talk about education at the ground level. How do teachers approach education? What are our students learning in schools? For what purpose are they learning? How much burden and responsibility can be placed on the teachers? How much authority do they have in their own approach to teaching? What is the student's responsibility in all this? The parents. What is the role of government in regards to education? Is a standardized testing a hindrance or a merit? These are the questions that we should be tackling and talking about foremost before even bringing up any statistics or numbers. Lacking a philosophy of education, how can we begin to talk about its consequences or development? A policy without philosophy is guidance without wisdom. So before we get into all these questions, Cody, do you have any comments or input?
No, I think that these are pretty good things to talk about. I mean, the only question I would have is, I guess, how do the different countries actually like get rated? Like, what are the curriculum for these rankings or whatever? If you can sum that up briefly.
To sum it up briefly, these are based on the average PISA scores, average PISA scores, which is the program of international student assessment, and this is the what the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Nations, the OECD nations, use to determine educational rankings. So these are all you
But is
can.
that like a test that is done
Yes, it's a
that?
test that each nation that's in the OECD does, and they administer
Okay.
equal tests, equal standard, equal methods, and apply those standards across the board. And the U.S. is around the lower 50th percentile, which is problematic, really, considering our supposed standards, right? But at the same time, if we're not trying to talk about statistics right now, right? We're not talking about education in terms of statistics. We're talking about what is education supposed to be, and that's what I think we should try to focus on today.
Right. I just was curious.
Right. So we'll go deeper into all those topics later, but let's start with the ground level question. So, how do teachers approach education, and how should it be approached? Now, this varies from classroom to classroom. There are teachers with varying degrees of passion and motivation. And speaking from personal experience, I had fun teachers, boring teachers, strict teachers, indifferent teachers, challenging teachers, easy teachers, and a mixture of all of them, right? But shelving the subjective factor, there's a unifying approach or goal in their teaching, and that's that we learn so that we pass the standardized testing. That's what education has become, whether teachers like it or not. Never mind learning for a moment. The goal isn't to learn, the goal is to pass. And I can frankly say that I barely remember a lot of things I learned in school precisely because I was memorizing information to regurgitate on a test rather than actually learning information with an understanding of the value of knowledge. So I think that's the first problem with our education system. We don't teach students the value of learning, or at the least, we fail to because the goal has become about performance and standardized testing. So that the school can, get more funding and grants, that becomes the goal. And you have to wonder what's the students actually learn in school, right? And that's the point of discussion that I don't think is being talked about enough. So Cody, what are your thoughts on the current education curriculum and the subjects that students are taught in school?
I mean, as I said before, there's things missing from the curriculum, particularly kind of what you're talking about. Just how to think, really, and why are you, what is the purpose of thought, and all these important questions that really are like the fundamental way to understand everything around you. This should be one of the first things they teach before they try and teach anybody, high level algebra or chemistry or something like that.
Right, right.
Um, as for the other subjects, I feel like it is important to just get a general understanding on the basics of it. So I feel like teaching English, history, and all these other things are important, but doing it in the way that you said, and not just trying to teach for the test, is clearly more important.
Right. And I would like to see less emphasis actually on the specialized sciences and math, right? They're important for sure, but that should be for a certain amount of students that want to pursue those careers. And at least while we have a general education that's mandatory in place, it should be focused on more general topics and really about improving the character and the knowledge and wisdom of a child rather than,
I would say having options for a student would be nice. A lot of the time in high school, you're kind of just set on this path until you get into around like senior year. You can start choosing your classes.
right. So I like.
So
Mhm.
I
Continue.
mean, not. It would be good to at least have the exposure to algebra and chemistry if you chose to get that exposure. But if you didn't, it would be nice to have another option that was somewhat similar.
Right. So a rudimentary version of general science would be better than a specialized chemistry class that you learn for a year. right? That's probably somewhere along the lines that we were talking about. And I like to see these less emphasis on specialized math and sciences, and instead have more classes in critical thinking, like we were talking about, and ethics and general philosophy that will teach students to be able to think for themselves and make opinions on their own, without relying on emotions or social pressure or popular culture. I think that teaching a student how to become informed and deliberate on the information while knowing the value of being informed is the pinnacle of education. It's not just about college or getting that dream job. It's about how they will shape the future, how they will develop their political, philosophical, and moral landscapes and worldview. I'm not suggesting that we start this process in the first grade, obviously, but the educational programs should be built with this goal in mind. And this goal of performing well on tests is quite frankly insulting to the spirit of learning and the institution of education. Any thoughts on
I
that?
couldn't agree more. My only question, I guess, is like, has it always been this way? Is America, I mean, have we always kind of taught for the test, or have we fallen off our path in some way down the line?
Well, we've always had some form of tests, and I think this is where this is a great introduction to what the next point is. We need to we need some method of being able to determine what a student knows and is capable of, right? And that's the goal of a standardized testing or any test, really. I would like to see less emphasis on these tests being multiple choice or fill in the blanks. I would like to see essays becoming the more determining factor. Anybody can memorize formulas, definitions, and dates to fill in circles, but not everyone can express themselves thoughtfully, meaningfully, and in a manner that truly shows the maturity, experience, and thought and character of a person. So, if given the choice between the SAT score or an essay to determine the capability of a person, I would, without hesitation, go with the latter. So I would like to move away from these. I wouldn't want to say archaic because these are still modern practices, but these old practices or traditional practices of testing with filling in circles and filling in blanks and writing dates and formulas. These are not a determining factor of a person's capability. Let's go for something more open, more that actually digs into who someone is, a student is, and I think that will be more helpful for us in the long term. Now we can go deeper into all these ground level questions and talk for hours, but let's change tracks here for a little bit and talk about the role of government education. So, what are your thoughts about this on this, Cody?
Well, as I said, I believe that it is important to have some restrictions on what a school should be allowed to teach. I mean, you don't want teachers teaching in science class that the Earth is 4,000 years old, for instance. But I'm also fine with theology classes that do teach that, if as long as the students are aware that there's some kind of bias going on in the classroom. But I mean, I don't feel as though the standardized testing is, which is really what the government is doing, is working, as you've said. So that's kind of a big issue that the government needs to address, or the people need to address, where the government's line should be crossed in terms of its role in our schools.
All right, and those are all interesting points. And now, as you know, I'm a big fan of small government, so I'm not a big proponent of the government stepping in and trying to fix a system that they're arguably responsible for breaking. In fact, it's not a controversial claim, I would say, to say the standard of education is largely subjective to begin with different groups wanting different systems. So if a family wants to homeschool their child and teach them creationism and take a religious approach to education, I'm not against that notion. I do personally think that it's not a good form of education, and I do personally think that's factually false. But my opinion doesn't matter, and neither does the government's in this regard. Parents have a right to educate their children as they please. It's protected in the First Amendment. Some argue that this is brainwashing, or enforcing religious homeschooling on children is a form of abuse. But this is a dangerous line to tread. Like telling any group of people, religious or not, that doing what they deem best for their children is abuse is essentially tyranny. Is even coming down from a rational or a benevolent intent. Simply put, I believe most things should be handled through the states, including education. Society doesn't start at the government; it starts with the community, and it's up to the community to set the standards and build the society they want to live in, and that includes the methods of education as well as its approach. Now, I've been pretty vocal on what education should be, but at the end of the day, that's just my personal desire and view of what education ought to be. I have no claim upon anybody else and their standards of education, and ultimately, it should be a more democratic process on a local or at the most state level. The government does not know you like your community knows you. The government does not care about you like your community cares about you. The community knows more, cares more, and is directly affected. And thus, it seems a no-brainer for me that the community should have the ultimate decision on how education is approached and managed. And now I realize this brings into question of impoverished communities or otherwise disadvantaged ones, particularly the inner cities and how they factor into all this. And I acknowledge that it's
Well,
not.
before you get to that, I do have one question to throw in real quick, if you
All
don't
right,
mind.
sure, yeah.
I was just gonna ask if, I mean, obviously, I would totally agree, perhaps with the state government stepping in the place of the federal government, so that it's more localized and everything like that. But do you feel like there should be any kind of regulations on what a state-run school should teach, as long as it's still a public place? Or do
Well,
you think they should just be allowed to basically compete against other schools in some way, and that's how you decide which is best?
well, there is a competition no matter what the system is, right? Schools competing, people competing to get to whatever college, whatever jobs. There's always been competition. What I'm talking about more so when I'm talking about how you let the communities decide is that yes, it's both you and I agree that it's pretty silly to say that dinosaurs didn't exist or that this magic man in the sky created the universe. But parents have a right to teach that their children that and instill
I'm not
their
arguing with that. My question, I'm
right.
fine with the public school thing. I mean, if you're privately teach your kid that, I'm talking specifically about a public, um, locally or state-run school. Should they be restricted or regulated?
Well, those regulations should be based on what the people that live there vote on, right? In my opinion, it would be best if it's as localized as possible. So a local county should vote on, how their county education system should be run, and then the states could, every member of those counties can group together and have another vote, and then they can have another system that's statewide. But it starts with from bottom up, not top down. Is I guess what I'm trying to say.
I get you.
Right.
I think we would agree on that.
Right. So the next part is that I think this is the biggest problem that I don't have an answer to is that you do have these impoverished communities, and it's something that's really is it's troubling. It's a I want to say self-replicating problem, right? That doesn't it's never gonna solve itself. You can't just say, well, let those people that live there decide decide for themselves and fend for themselves and they'll fix it. It's not gonna happen like that, right? It's like a dog eat dog world like over there. And if we really care as a society, then we need to find ways to help them ourselves. I don't think that relegating the duty to the care of the government has been very effective. This welfare checks and just handing out money, throwing money at the problem. This is what it kind of becomes, in my opinion. And that's not how solutions are made. That's how crutches are made. And if you really want to help these people rise up, then I think there has to be something more than just throwing money at the problem. And I'm not saying I have all the answers for this, but I think it starts with us personally getting involved somehow in some manner, right? Not just saying there is some other organization that I give my money to that will take care of all these problems. I don't think that's helpful. I think really it starts with us as individuals saying, look, enough is enough. This is a bad situation for these people, like for our fellow Americans. Let's find a way to help them. And that's going to be bringing the real progress, not the federal government mailing a few checks, right? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that your other point about teaching things that are critical thinking, as well as with the local community decides. I mean, if these local communities are able to decide, hey, let's start teaching kids how to become mechanics or other skilled workers, like at an earlier age, around in high school. Um, those kids might have a better shot at finding a way to the middle class than just trying to teach them, oh, you got to go to college, and like this is the only way, even though you're not going to be able to afford it. So Yeah, it seems like um, obviously the just throwing more money at the problem, that's just clearly hasn't worked. It's been going on for a while now, and we're not seeing any progress in that regard, in my opinion. So,
Right, and let's move on to the question of funding now. Do you think our public schools are funded adequately? And if not, how much more should we be investing in our schools? And as a follow-up, do you think that the problem with our education system is the lack of funding?
um, well, it kind of greatly varies in the United States, which is a little bit strange. I personally live in a county where we pay a very high public school tax, and our school systems in the area are very good. Kids tend to excel in college after leaving this area as long as they apply themselves at the school. There's all kinds of different programs, even college classes that students can take here. But like I said, the funding and the tax rate here is much higher than even 30 minutes south of me in my own state. So it seems like that does have something to do with it. Um, as for whether that's the only problem, probably not. But it does definitely help if you're paying your teachers well enough. And there's all kinds of different resources that the students have access to in comparison to somewhere where these things aren't happening.
All right, and those are all interesting points, and I won't pretend to know the answer to this question. I'm not, looking up all these funding reports on how much, how every community and every state is spending on their education budget. But in my humble opinion, I think funding is almost a lazy excuse for incompetency, right? We don't need brand new computers, monitors, or the latest edition of textbooks to teach students adequately. And I'm speaking from experience. I have several years of teaching under my belt, and I have taught several classes with only a broken piece of chalk and a stained chalkboard and a printed copy of an outdated textbook. Was it ideal? Of course not. But did it hinder my ability to teach kids or for the students to learn? Not at all. I make an engaging lesson plan, have activities that have the students actively partaking in the process of learning, be it math, English, or science. The knowledge is abundantly available even on just a Google to print out or to glance at through your phone. We forget that just 50 years ago we didn't have all these new technology. We seem to think that it's so essential now. And in fact, by cursory estimates and data online, our standard of education has slipped drastically since then. So perhaps we do need funding and investment in better teachers. But in my opinion, if funding is a problem on the material level and not on the personnel level, it seems to be more of an excuse than a real problem, unless the school is literally in the process of collapsing. What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely agree. More funding should go to the actual teachers. I mean, teachers are pretty underpaid all over America. They earn a bit more, and Californian counties that are highly taxed for their public schools, and like I said, my area is also pretty highly taxed for this, so our teachers get paid well. I know that teachers in my area get paid almost twice as much as the rest of my state do, however. So, I mean, that's obviously going to have something to do with the quality of your education. If people that are, expert teachers or that have really learned the subject and then they decide not to become teachers because there's no benefit to it in certain counties, at least.
Right, right. Um, and that's an interesting point. So there is definitely, I guess, according to you, a wage gap, even in the same profession, depending on the locale. But I wonder, so you have to, there's a long process of education for higher education. I mean, in colleges and universities, in order to get your teaching license, and I think that has less to do with funding than it has to do with the individual, the individual care to learn uh, the knowledge efficiently. Is someone from where your area is teaching? Is that teacher more qualified? Would you say than someone that is from a different state that perhaps doesn't spend as much funding on paying their teachers, but they still got educated from a, you would arguably say equal university systems, wouldn't you say?
I wouldn't say they're more qualified in my area. They might have more motivation, I guess. I mean, this obviously isn't a blanket statement, but I can probably assume that there's more motivated teachers in a higher paying area than there are in an area where they're not getting higher paid.
Right, right. I think that's a fair point. So it's, capitalism at work. More you get paid, the more motivation you have to do a better job. And this brings us to our last segment. Should private schools be banned? You already know my thoughts on private personalized education. I'm not a fan of it in particular, but I believe it's the right of a parent to educate their children in a way that seems proper to them. We see more and more people arguing that private education drains money out of public education, but the government subsidies, they're actually they're very, very small, and they function almost entirely on tuition and donations. So frankly, I don't understand the controversy aside from people wanting an equal standard of education across the board, which is only desirable if you want an equally poor standard of education for everyone, in my opinion. And as I've said, it's up to the communities to determine not only the quality but the contents of education. Excuse me, of education. So we are so focused on democracy on a national level, but we forget that the foundation of democracy is built on the interest of individuals in their local communities. So if a county predominantly Mormon wants to have an education system that caters to their beliefs and standards, then it's entirely their right to have such. For other people outside of that community to come, barging in, claiming that they know better for what's better for everyone, and enforcing their own standard of education is the definition of tyranny and oppression. Just let education be free, and I don't mean monetarily. I mean let education be free metaphysically. Let it take the shape that it will in accordance to the community of people seeking it. And if that means a private school, then so be it. It's not in anybody's authority to limit how others pursue their ideal system of education. What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely think private schools should be allowed to exist. I would like to see a more objective kind of curriculum in private school. Like they can teach the theology and all that stuff, but I would still like to at least have them be exposed to the idea of like evolution and all the stuff that they might not hear about from a very religious person. Just the exposure alone, I think, would be sufficient for me, regardless if they even teach it as fact. Just be like, hey, a lot of people believe in this. This is the scientific standard. We don't have to accept it as true. If they did that, that would be enough for me. But as of right now, I don't like how certain schools just don't even talk about, what we would accept as scientific fact.
Right, right, right. And what about equality of education? We've had a discussion before on that. Have you changed your mind on this? Do you think that it's okay if there are some disparaging, standards of education that is basically inevitable, right? Or do you think that the government should try to enforce and have a standard that everyone should have equal education, essentially?
I mean, I think the ideal would be that everyone has a somewhat equal, at least, opportunity to have an equal learning experience. But as you've said, it's really not practical to have or request that at this point. We should do what you were saying, and I really liked the point. The local teaching, just teach people locally what would be best for them. So that's what I was talking about when I was saying, in these poorer counties where people might not have the means to even afford to go to college without some kind of scholarship, and there's a limited number of scholarships, you could teach these kids how to be skilled workers instead at an early age, and that would probably do bounds and leaps in terms of bringing them into the middle class. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to consider, especially if you had private schools teaching kids how to do trade, as well as teaching them about the standard learnings that we would need for high school graduation. I'd be totally for that. That'd be great private school. So it's a good point.
Right, and I'll add on to that many people frankly don't know what they want in regards to education. So we do have a lot of group of people that don't know the first thing about an efficient learning program. but just blindly send their kids to whatever institution based on hype or other social influences. And it's all tragic in its own way, but it's a mistake that is theirs to make, not ours to prevent. We can only be so much held accountable for the ignorance of others. And it's not the government's duty to hold your hand and educate you on an efficient education program, at least not in my view. Any thoughts on this?
I mean, I would agree with you up to a point. We do have, social welfare in our nation and all these other things. So there's a long-term effect that's going to happen if you don't teach people something that's valuable in school, and then they end up basically, as a minimum wage employee for the rest of their life potentially if they never learn a skill. So we need to consider things from all sides, I suppose. But there also clearly is too much, federal oversight at this point, especially with the teaching and everything like that. I think that finding the balance between both would be the best way to go about it. And as you said, it's probably the balance needs to be local or locally decided at least.
Right. And I think that wraps up our discussion for today. Unless you have any extra questions or points to add.
No, I think that you covered pretty much all the questions I was going to ask as you were discussing your topic, so that was great.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time with a brand new topic.
See you all.